I would love to begin our world building panel. So we have invited 4 of our favorite authors, to all queens of urban fantasy, to talk with us about world building. World building is such an interesting topic, and we've talked a little earlier about how urban fantasy is a really interesting genre because it's got all of the magic and inspiration of fantasy, but it sort of drags our real life context in with it. And with looking at some of these, having just read different examples from you, I'd actually love to just start by having, you talk about the selection that we just read, and what are some of your favorite, and I'll just go in the order that we read them. Actually, I'll start with Patty, but what are some of the things that we would have seen in that piece, and the interesting things that you were doing there? Any favorite tips or techniques about introducing a big new world?
Okay, so the story I had you read from was a particularly difficult one to start because it's the second in a series of short stories set in a greater world of, the Mercy Thompson world and the Alpha and Omega world. But I couldn't count on, because it was coming out in an anthology, I couldn't count on whoever was reading the story to have read me before, to have read the first of the short stories before. But I also knew that there'd be a number of people who have read both me, the short stories, and then eventually, hopefully, all of the short stories, and they're reading all of these Seal short stories at the same time. So I'm going to put my glasses on. I'm sorry, they're catching the light a little bit, so we'll try it, but I can't see what's going on without them. It was a challenge. I had to introduce a seal as a werewolf, and then let everybody know that this was, he was in the middle of a gift that was given to him, where he's getting dates from an online dating sites. The whole, without boring the people who have just read the first story. So it was a fun challenge, and now I'm on the third story and I'm doing it again. So I don't know. I won't set up and say I have succeeded, but I will say that was the problem I was looking at with that first story.
Yeah, and how did you think about that? Like that is something that keeps happening, as series get longer in general, but it's even tighter on space in the short story. So you don't have that much space to work with.
Right. And that was another problem with it, is that it has the short stories. Novel writing is like hockey games, where you have a lot of room, and you can be a little crude, and you can have things not quite work right, and you can have, as long as there's enough blood and hair and teeth on the ice by the end of the game, and you hit the goalpost. That's all that matters. And a short story is more like I don't know, more like the dancing part of an ice skating, like the pairs in figure skating, where you have certain things that you want to get done, and everything is important from one to the other, and you can have a few missteps and still carry the day, but not very many. And what you're looking at is a very tightly wound whole, and it means that the beginning of the story has to do more than one thing, but one of the things it has to do is introduce the characters and the place and the problem, and pull the readers right into, so they feel very comfortable with where the story is going. But it has to do more than that. It also has to start out the story. It has to give you a reason to read on, so you're interested in the characters. You know a little bit more about the conflicts that they're going through. So for me, it's probably the most technical thing I do, is do the beginning of a short story.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense and is really interesting. Thank you, Patty. And I realize I should probably have reintroduced you before we jumped into. I was just too curious about hearing about the opening, but this is Patricia Briggs. She's the #1 New York Times bestselling author of the Mercy Thompson series, the Alpha and Omega series. She's written 28 novels and counting. our most recent one being Smoke Bitten, which we heard about earlier. And I will just take this moment to do a quick, share my excitement about all of the folks who are going to be on our panel. So next we will have, we heard from Dina Cameron. Dina Cameron shared her first of her Fangborn novels intro with us. Dina writes across many genres, but especially crime and speculative fiction. And she is a real life archaeologist, which inspired her work and informed it on the Emma Fielding mysteries and the Fangborn novels. She has won a whole lot of awards, the Anthony, Agatha, and McCavity Awards, and her work has been turned into a TV series, which appeared on the Hallmark Movie and Mystery Channel. And in addition to the Fangborn series, which we read from being available on Amazon for the sale price of, I think, 99 cents right now, she's actually got 2 short stories that we wanted to highlight. One is the new Corbridge Free State, which is appearing in the Dystopian States of America, a charity anthology that actually benefits the ACLU Foundation. And in June, she's going to have Raven and the Cave Girl in Shattering Glass, a Nasty Woman press anthology. We've also got, from our second reading about Sid the Skeleton, we've got Toni Kelner, who also writes under the name Leigh Perry. She has written 17 novels, 1 collection. She has co-edited or co-edited, I think, 7 anthologies now. Many are all in urban fantasy. She's an Agatha Award winner, nominee for also endless awards. This is a very well decorated panel.
I'm not in urban fantasy. I'm sorry. I write mostly mystery. My family's mysteries are paranormal mysteries, which flops over into urban fantasy.
I see. Paranormal mystery is the, and in my earlier spiel about genres, this is it's a great articulation. Thank you, Toni. And as we mentioned earlier, Toni had started her career writing limericks for Dragon magazine, and we might see if is there any chance you would share a limerick with us, Toni?
I can share one of the less dirty ones, because I did have one that was turned down by Dragon magazine because they said, "Oh, we love it, it's hilarious." No, we cannot print this. But the one I usually quote, which is fairly family friendly, was a dour old dwarf named Fritz was burned right where he sits. That happens, they say, when you get in the way of a dragon just as he spits.
You know what? I remember that. That's awesome.
You really? I actually had Mike Cole, who's a military science fiction writer, come up. I was just chatting with him at a Boscone convention a long time ago, and we were talking about D&D and how we had both played, and he actually said, they used to have limericks in the Dragon magazine, and darned if he did not quote one of my limericks, not realizing it was me because they'd been written under my maiden name. and he thought I was kidding, and I thought he was kidding.
I love that. They're like, there's someone already does this, Toni. And one more thing, Toni has also won the Romantic Times Career Achievement Award for Amateur Sleuth Mysteries, which is an amazing genre. And then last but certainly not least, I want to mention Charlaine Harris, who did our interview earlier and is in our panel. She wrote her first book in 1981. She's been on every bestseller list I've ever looked at many times. She writes urban fantasy, science fiction, horror, has 30 books or more under her belt, 3 graphic novels, many short stories, and 3, soon to maybe be 5 TV shows as well. So really prolific and well decorated, as I mentioned. Toni Kelner also writes under the name Leigh Perry. Thank you. The chat is keeping me honest. Thank you so much. So Toni Kelner is also Leigh Perry. And Toni, I would actually love to take it to you now and say, you shared your reading about Sid, the introduction to skeletons in the family. What are some of your favorite techniques when you're introducing, a really alternate world to readers?
Well, the one thing about mysteries is they're written out, especially in what they call the cozy or the amateur sleuth kind of subset, is that we are introducing new worlds all the time. More often they're real worlds. There's someone who works in a bakery, there's someone who runs a bed and breakfast, or even someone who's a police officer, all these different things. So making it a made up thing really wasn't that much more difficult, except for I had to kind of make up the rules. But by working with Sid, who's a skeleton, I didn't have to describe what he looks like, because, you know, we all know what a skeleton looks like. They're everywhere. There's skeletons under every one of our skins. So that kind of made it easier. But mainly I just try to treat it very much in a matter-of-fact way. There was an essay, or not an essay, it was a little spoof novel one time, a short story written one time, and I can't remember who wrote it. I think it was Randall Garrett, and he's describing the real world as if it had been in one of the really super science pulp novels.
Randall
Like,
Garrett.
was it Randall Garrett?
Yes, it was.
Okay, thank you, helpful voice from beyond. And he said, you know, wow, and he said, I got onto the autobus, amazing contraption to get me from here to my place of work. And I sat down next to someone and said, my, what a wonderful contrivance these autobuses are. Yes, yes, they are. Whereas most people don't really do that when they get on the bus. No one I've ever seen does that when they get, mainly they get the heck out of my way. You sit down. So that's kind of the way approach I want to have, is to get the heck out of my way approach.
That makes a lot of sense, and I actually think it leads quite nicely into going to Charlaine, who we read next, where you are, you know, in this you're introducing characters who borrow a little bit from established archetypes. You know, we all know what a skeleton looks like, but you're also introducing a quite different world than the one we, you know, quite different history. And so how do you, you know, both how do you think about that, and, you know, really like how you think about, you know, techniques for getting a lot of information into the reader's head that they might need? Oh,
I hope I got that whole question. I try to just present things as being as factual as possible, as ordinary as possible. And then I work in an explanation so the reader won't feel totally lost. But I like to plunge into a world without a lot of build up. I like to work the information. You need to understand it in bits and pieces, so you don't get a big glob of exposition. It helps the story to move along while you can kind of assimilate what the world consists of as you go along.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, like your selection actually was from chapter 5. It wasn't at the very beginning. So, you know, we don't learn all of this right away.
No, I think, at first it's just shooting, bang, 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 bang.
Patricia, you'd like to?
I think we're all of an age where we remember where all of the science fiction and fantasy, particularly the fantasy novels, started out with prologues, like 4 or 5 page prologues. And I don't know about you, but as a reader, I never read them. It was years before I realized that the Dragon Riders series was supposed to be science fiction and not fantasy. Because that's all in the introduction.
Yeah.
And as we
learned that today.
Right. So as we writers, well, good. So as we writers, remember the things that didn't work for people who have passed. I mean, I stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So remember the things that did not work for us as readers, then we go on and try something else. And the idea of building the world via context clues is I mean, we depend upon our readers to trust us a little bit, but it makes for a much better story. And it helps, like in Charlaine's case, where she's building, she has a world that we're all familiar with that she can pull us into right up front. Oh, we have a gunfight and it feels like a Western. And she's throwing in terms that we don't quite know, and you're gonna have to, you know, that are a combination between Mexico and Texas and things like that. So we know this is not really our world, but we feel pretty comfortable as readers in it because it feels like like the standard Western environment with a little additions. So we don't feel, as readers, we don't feel uncomfortable, and we're willing to wait until she's ready to tell us all of the ins and out of the world. And I really love that about Charlaine's writing. Rob McKinley does that very well too.
Oh, yeah.
Just teaching us with context clues, right? Scorpio races, Maggie Stiefvater did an excellent job of that. But you have to be able to write like Charlaine in order to get your readers to trust you to carry that far.
Right. There's some suspension of disbelief at the beginning if you can't quite catch up with everything. You have to start holding on. Okay, I'll remember this word and this is going to come up later. I wanted to go to you, Dana. You shared the beginning of your Fangborn series where we actually start with a pretty mundane, if very sad moment of somebody, you know, finding out that their mother's very ill. You know, how did you approach, you know, the weaving in of the supernatural?
It was a challenge because I wrote the first Fangborn short story that Charlaine and Toni invited me to, sorry, I'm hearing an echo in my head.
You sound okay to us.
Okay, great. And they said, we want to see what your werewolves would look like. And I was so pleased, so proud. And then I was so terrified because I didn't have any reference books on werewolves. And that's my first thing as a recovering academic. I got to go do the research, get to the books, and figure out what I'm going to say about it. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? And I'd written 6 mystery novels at this point. And it took me a good solid 15 minutes of sitting and sweating and thinking, oh my God, I can't do this. I can't let these women down. And it took me that long to realize, to say, okay, I can make this up. This is fiction. And it was this blinding moment to me. Because when you're an academic, you're not allowed to make things up. And that with my Emma Fielding mysteries, I was writing them from the point of view of an archaeologist because I knew that. I wanted that to be realistic. And so when I came up with the character of Jerry and Claudia, their siblings, they were fully invested in being Fangborn. They loved it. Jerry in particular was this, he just loved being a werewolf I got to know him as, I loved being a werewolf for the same reasons I loved being a police officer. And that just gave me his character. But when I went to write a novel, I realized I need to introduce someone from the outside. So Zoe knows there's something wrong with her, but has no idea that she's Fangborn or that there are other people like her. And so I use her to take the reader and into that world, and so she can, we're learning the same time she is. And right. She hasn't been raised with all this like Jerry has. So she's like, you know, some of this, I don't believe it. How can you never be wrong about going after the bad guys? How are you always right? I'm not sure I buy that. And so it was making very deliberate choices. She had to be a werewolf because if she was a vampire, they take a snake form. And it's really difficult for a chase scene to have a snake. It's like slithering along. She had to be, sorry?
That's a classic way. Yeah, it's a classic way of introducing a speculative world, is to bring an outsider in, like the reader is an outsider, and we can both learn it together. And it works really, really well. It's a really good way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was useful to me because I was able to bring her archaeological eye to all of this and the skepticism. That it was fun to have her butt up against Jerry, who was a true believer. I had to make a lot of choices that were different for the first novel than I did for the short stories.
Toni had a cup. She needs to hold that cup up and say something so everybody out there can see the cup that she has.
Yes, that's an excellent mug.
Yes, the book cover for Wolfsbane and Mistletoe, which was the anthology we all kind of, like, Charlaine and I knew Dana, of course, was the first dealings I'd had with Patricia, other than with reading her books with glee and happiness. So we all have stories in this anthology, which came out at some point, and I had mugs made for distributors.
I still have my mug. Thank you very, very much. And I think this is really fun to have a reunion from that anthology sitting right here. When I first saw the list of people who were going to be on the show, that's what I thought. Oh, it's a reunion of Wolves Baby.
A happy reunion.
Yes,
Right?
and we have to thank Toni for help putting this together. On that note, like Toni really was a huge help in saying, like, let's have a reunion. like these are people I would love to talk about this with.
Always.
Let's have a show. We can do it in
Let's
my
put on a show.
So I really like the idea. So bringing in a newcomer is one of the classic ways. Another you hear a lot about is like, as you know, Bob, where that one's not as highly regarded because it's a bit of an info dump. But one thing that I noticed, a lot of these worlds tend to use some of the same character archetypes, I would say. You know, vampires appear in many of these worlds, werewolves appear in many of these worlds, and you also get some more customized creepies. How do you think about, you know, when you're looking to see who to populate your worlds with? And I'll throw this one first to you, Charlaine, just because you've written a world that was featured the vampires very prominently. You know, how do you think of using, you know, the pros and the cons, and, you know, what's easier or what's harder if you're using an established type of creepy?
Well, I start off with one kernel of an idea. In this case, it was a barmaid who couldn't date regular people. And from that tiny little bit of an idea, everything just sort of gathered around that. The fact that she couldn't read vampire minds, so she could date vampires. I had no idea vampires were going to be in it until it started expanding and grew to the state it eventually got to, which was enormous, with a cast of, honestly, it felt like thousands of characters. But that, it just grew from the germ of an idea, so it all had to work to make her who she was. And that was the beginning of the idea, and then the world evolved to make her the person she had to be to tell the story I wanted to tell. That seems very convoluted, but that's the way my starts of books work.
Then it sounds convoluted, but it also makes sense. And Patricia, I see. I was going to go to you next anyway and ask the same question, but you can just take it.
Well, one of the things about using archetypal type monsters like vampires and werewolves and ghosts and witches and things is that as a writer, they work as a shortcut. We don't want to bore our readers by giving them long, involved descriptions of creatures that are not. And the more of those that you do in a book, the harder they are. If you have one, that's fine, but it's like Cthulhu. You have one description and then you carry it through a series of books until everybody knows what Cthulhu is. But other than that, you know, a movie can show you a different creature. But books, we have to work with what people already know. So vampires and werewolves and ghosts and dragons and all of that, you know, in fantasy, dragons and the typical monsters that we use, then as a writer, all we have to do is tell you how our creatures differ from what you think of when you hear that power word. So I say dragon, every person here, every person out there hears the word dragon, and you have a picture in your head what a dragon looks like. And then all I have to do is say, well, my dragon is a Chinese dragon, you're right? And it's, and I can give you cues that give you a big picture in your head with relatively few words, and it doesn't drag the story down. Description always drags the story down. So by using these archetypal characters, then we can make the story run. Urban fantasy, as it exists now, because urban fantasy existed before our current iteration of urban fantasy, and it was quite a bit different. So, you know, Tim Powers' urban fantasy is a lot different from what we consider an urban fantasy now. And what it was driven by sales. When they asked me to write an urban fantasy, they said that they had experimented with other kinds of creatures. There was a really good romance series that dealt with goblins, for instance, and I cannot remember the author or the books right now, but anyway.
If
But they
anyone
just,
in the chat finds it, let us know.
okay. And they were really awesome. But they didn't pull the readers in as the vampires and the werewolves did. So when they asked me to write urban fantasy, they said, okay, this book has to deal with vampires and or werewolves and involve a heroine. The main character needs to be female with a complicated love life involving werewolves and vampires. She doesn't herself have to be a werewolf or vampire. And that's what the sales department at Penguin, which for the first, maybe decade of urban fantasy as it exists now, Penguin dominated that era. They had Penguin Rock combination. They had Laurel K. Hamilton and Charlaine and Jim Butcher and me, and briefly they had Kelly Armstrong, and now they have her back again as they combined. But they had determined what it was that readers wanted to read. And a lot of it has to do with most of the readers that pulled into urban fantasy. Well, a lot of the readers that pulled into urban fantasy weren't fantasy readers. They were romance readers. And they were just exploring a little bit. And by giving them archetypal characters that they already knew, werewolves and vampires and things like that, we made them feel at home in a way that if they had opened Tolkien, they wouldn't have.
Gadi and I actually talk a lot about resonance. He likes the word resonance, where seeing, things that create patterns for people, make them, give them this feeling of home. And so, the idea of, feeling at home because of, frankly, alarming elements, if you encountered them in real life, were present is very real in this genre, I think. I wanted to turn it over to, throw this one over to Dana. When you're, introducing a type of character that, does exist and there's a lot written about, so your Fangborn are not exactly werewolves. How do you decide on what differences you're going to make? Like, what comes first in deciding what type of changes you want to make to it?
Well, the first part was what I described before with that panic. And I like, if I go with a canon, is it going to be movies? Is it going to be Charlaine's vampires? Is it going to be Anne Rice's vampires? What do I do here? And I realized when I could make them up, I want them to be secret superheroes, like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the X-Men sort of combined. And so I'm like, okay, vampires and werewolves have traditionally always been each other's throats. It's because they both have fangs. They must be family. And so I had the Fangborn. It's the way, I think the same way that Joss Whedon came up with Firefly for the ship. So I know another dead to him. And I added oracles just because someone said, wait, get an oracle in here. And I just love the idea of that in a really tense situation. But then I'm like, the vampires are not, they're weakened by the dark. They need the sun to power them. The werewolves are going to be pretty straightforward werewolves. The oracles will have all sorts of weird abilities and powers and things. And I basically wanted them to be the good guys who are the first on the crime scene. And so that's why people have this idea of them being the bad guys. Like they're first on the scene to investigate, but like a big scary monster on the scene doesn't really inspire a lot of confidence. So it was going down that list and thinking about what skills I needed them to have to complement each other.
I really like
kind
that
of pitfalls.
Oh yeah, I really like that idea of like starting from thinking about what real world dynamic you want to create. And I wanted to turn it to you, Toni. Like you've, not only done a lot of writing yourself, but you've put together a lot of anthologies where you're, thinking about how to, pair multiple stories with one another. I'm interested in, where do you start when you're creating, Sid or a type of creature? Like what do you find is often the process of real life inspiration becoming a type of character for you?
me, one of the hardest parts is always trying to do something different. And that's really kind of how I ended up with Sid, is because I was between series, which means my series had been canceled and the one I was trying to sell was not selling. So I was trying to think, well, what's popular in mysteries these days? And it's like, well, and my editor said paranormal, historical, and crafts. She says, please do not send me a craft. And it's like, okay, so I'm thinking paranormal. And I thought, well, you know, I don't really want to do vampires. I mean, my best friend Charlaine Harris, no, she's doing those. And werewolves, yeah, Dana and Patricia pretty much have those wrapped up, leave them alone. What can I do that's different? So I started going through, you know, Jim Butcher's got the warlock for hire. We got witches, we've got cats, we've got ghosts, we've got ghost cats. All these different things were being done in paranormal mystery. What was left? And for some reason, nobody was doing a skeleton mystery. Why? I don't know. It just never occurred to anyone else because they weren't drinking the same thing I was, I guess. So I started. So Sid was pretty much based on what can I do different. And I'm going to tell you this. I just found this out this morning, and I don't know whether I should be amused, pleased, or really mad. Somebody has just published a novel with the sidekick skeleton character, another cozy mystery.
Wow.
Really?
I guess that's just, you know, flattery. I don't know. She may have never heard of mine. Not like mine are world famous or anything, but still. But as far as
It's okay to have more than one feeling about a thing.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I'm mixed. It's mixed. My husband's like, you know, should I go take her out? What? You know, I'm like, maybe not. But I was thinking about a short story I did. So the first urban fantasy, this really urban fantasy I wrote was a story for Charlaine from my first anthology, which was Many Bloody Returns. And what you're talking about, putting things together, Dana, this was putting together vampires and birthdays because vampires have more birthdays than anyone else because they live so long. So, you know, we thought this was a great idea. And then I realized I had to write something. And someone said, what are your story going to be? And I said, it's going to be how Stella got her grave back. And I had no idea where I was going to go with that, other than it was going to be a vampire and a birthday. And what I was trying to do was, again, to do something that other people hadn't done. And in most time vampire stories, when a vampire is a new vampire, they have to sleep a long time. And as they become older and more powerful, they can stay awake more, they can endure the sun more, and they can do more tricks and things. And I thought, well, what if you've got a baby vampire? And what if you got a baby, you know, he's just become a vampire. And I kind of did it backwards, that he can stay up, he can stay out during the day. He just has to wear a lot of sunscreen. And, you know, he keeps hoping for the day when he's just living on blood, but he still has to eat food now. And he can't mesmerize anyone. All he does is stare at them. And they stare back. And he stares at him again. And it does absolutely nothing. And again, I was just trying to do something different. So whenever even with my own series, that's always the challenge, is like, what have I not done before? Because I always want to do something different that not everyone's doing. Because if I'm reading all these other ladies and they're doing things so well, it's like, yeah, I'm not messing with that. Which is why I thought I was safe with the skeleton started.
It brings up a really interesting, like, it almost gives me an image of like a broader shared extended universe that exists between the extended universes of each author, which where your own books live alongside one another, but there's also, you know, the awareness of the larger genre, and how, you know, you mentioned, Toni, how you're, you know, somebody's this is Charlaine's vampires. It's, you know, each author has their own vampires. How do you think about that when you're, you know, assembling an anthology? Like, does that, the ideas of shared genre as a universe almost?
Well, Charlaine can speak to this too. Basically, we just picked, when we were doing it, we would just invite people whose work we liked. We didn't, I don't think we worried about assembling them that way. We assembled the authors in that way. We tried to get new people. We ended up getting a lot of mystery people because we were both in the mystery world originally. We ran into a couple of people like, I've always wanted to write a werewolf story, which is Nancy Pickard, who's a award-winning mystery writer. And it's like, really? This was on your bucket list? It's like, let us in. And it just kind of, once we assembled the writers and invited them, I don't think we ended up turning down maybe 2 out of the 7 anthologies that didn't didn't quite fit in. So it was just kind of, it was assembling the people, it was assembling the Justice League rather than the particular issues of the comic.
Well, the Justice League of Oh, Charlaine.
She's muted.
Oh, you might be muted.
Oh, shall not mute Charlaine.
There you are.
We would send out our we would think of a guest list to ask people to submit stories, and we would get really excited. It was just like putting on a really good party, and you hope people would come. And honestly, the first one did pretty well, the first anthology. So people looked forward to getting invited, and people would start hinting that they would like to be invited, you know.
Some more subtle than others.
Yeah, subtle or not so subtle.
The fun thing about your anthologies was that there's not much of a market for short stories the way there was maybe 40 years ago. And a lot of writers I know got into writing novels by writing short stories. So getting invited into an anthology that is edited by you folks is a really big jump up. It's a really, for mid-list authors, this is a really good way to get new readers that are hard to find now. So we writers really appreciate you anthologists too.
We had a good time doing it. It really was a very smooth and harmonious process for us. I never made a Tony doll and stabbed it. We just got along real well, and we enjoyed the same things, and we agreed that the same stories that didn't work, how we could ask the writer to fix them. So it was really one of the most fun things I've ever done.
Yeah, I miss them. I really do.
What I liked about the series of the anthologies was that as a reader, nothing looked the same from one story to the next within one collection. Every single thing was vastly different. And as a writer, what I really enjoyed was the constraints, because I find it interesting to figure out a problem that you say, okay, it's going to be werewolves in the holidays. And that gives you a really, instead of having to write the whole world, you have like very specific set of things. And it's just a great puzzle to solve. And so, and I got some novels out of it. So I also thank you.
We were fairy godmother to a couple of different series. Alan Gordon wrote a novel based on his short story world. Dana's probably our most successful, but then we've got Mike Carey, who wrote a short story for an
The school anthology. Yeah, An Apple for the Creature.
And he then expanded it to a novel that did really well. He's done sequels to it, and it got made into a movie with Glenn Close.
Yep. S.J. Roseanne.
Oh yes, S.J. Roseanne.
Well, Patricia, you actually, the reading that you shared with us was from a short story in one of your worlds. How do you think about expanding your world by following a different voice? Like, I think that's a really cool, element. How do you decide whose voice wants to, come out?
So usually it's what's going to be the most fun thing to do. I would say that these online dating stories happened because I don't remember who came up with the idea, whether it was Anne, my trusty assistant, who's also known as Sparky, for various reasons. But we came up with this idea of a seal who is vain, and he's super dangerous. He's not wrong. He's super dangerous. And what would be the most horrible thing somebody could do to him? And then somebody started talking about online dating sites, and somehow we put the two of them together, and I've had so much fun with these stories. I am primarily a novelist. I have still written more novels than I have short stories. But when I started writing, when the books hit big, I got a number of invitations from people who are friends, for people who I was very, as you said, very flattered to be, or as I said, maybe very flattered to be invited to different anthologies. And I accepted a whole bunch of short story anthology invitations. And then I discovered how much fun it was to get in the heads of these characters that I had been writing for, depending on when it was the short stories came out, like 5 or 6 novels with this as a minor character. And I couldn't get in their head, even though I knew stuff, because the main character, whoever's voice the story was being told in, didn't understand these things about that person. So Mercy is, when I'm writing Mercy books, I'm very conscientious about making sure that we see people the way Mercy sees them, not the way I see them. So Mercy, for instance, always thought of Warren as her big brother, that kind of image, that he's a good guy, that he's just right. When, if you think about his background, you know he's got to be super dangerous, and he's killed a lot of people in order to stay alive, and he's okay with that. And so being able to write like in Red with Pearls, which was Warren's story, was a lot of fun, and telling people about, so it's more about people I'm interested in, and stories I want to share with people that I can't do in the novel format. And that's, I really love that about short stories. I'm not as good at them, generally speaking. They take me, per page, it takes me a lot longer to write a short story than a novel. In fact, the novella, Alpha and Omega novella, I have written novels in shorter periods of time than I wrote the Alpha and Omega novella. So, yeah.
Well, you just told us you wrote a 2-month novel, so. Right?
Well, and then I didn't write again for about 9 months.
All right, I wanted to talk about magic systems a little bit, or how we, you know, a big part of the fantasy part of urban fantasy is the magic. How do you and let's go to Dana first. How do you think about setting the constraints and the rules of your magic system?
That's a really good question. I decided that it's all going to be based in physics. And I was talking with a lot of folks who know about time, space, and black holes and entanglement. And that's how I decided that my werewolves and vampires were going to change. And the great thing was that because so few people know A, anything about it, or B, know anything serious about it, I could write fairly knowledgeably after watching some documentaries and reading. And then run it past a few people who know about physics, and I was pretty good. And in terms of magic, I don't have spells, but then I kind of cheat sometimes, and I do have work it, but I always tie it back into that notion of entanglement. And so far, I haven't really been able to get away from that. I like things to be fantastic, but I think our universe is pretty fantastic already. And if I can make up stuff to add to it, that's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I'm a nerd about this one, so I actually kind of want to take it to each of you, like Toni. Similarly, like, you know, how do you think about the limitations? How much to explain to the user, or to the user? I'm a programmer, you can tell. To the reader.
It's all right. I used to be a technical writer. I'm all about the user.
Okay. To the reader about, you know, how the rules of the magic work, what a person, you know, what Sid can or can't do. How do you think about making those decisions?
Well, with the first book, I had it, you know, pretty much established that he can hear, he can talk, all of which are impossible without lungs and sinew and all that other stuff. And then I kind of established in later books that George is technically the heroine of the series, but Sid kind of steals the show because there's a lot of academics and really not that many walking, talking skeletons. So he stands out. But in establishing this, I wanted to keep them almost reasonable and all very much will-based. I don't explain how Sid came to be. There is no explanation I could come up with that would make any sense whatsoever. So I don't use physics. I just say, there he is. If I were to kind of give it a formal explanation, it would be a ghost inhabiting his own skeleton, haunting himself. But he says he's not a ghost because he doesn't haunt, and he's corporeal. So it just depends on who you ask. The one explanation in the first book, I believe, was that he was bitten by a radioactive skeleton. But I don't think
a chicken and an egg problem there.
Yeah, no one really took that one seriously for some reason. But as far as what he can do, he walks. He's got very good hearing, and probably his best power is that he can detach. So if he wants to go and see what's going on, she can't really walk out. He is not, no one else in the world, but the family knows he exists. Is that she carries, Georgia will carry his head so he can listen and watch, and a hand so he can use his phone in the bag, and they can text to one another. That way she can text to him, or they can talk on the phone. Actually, he's right there listening, but everyone thinks she's on the phone. So I try not to give him, other than the detaching, and that he can move his pieces at a distance, like if his thumb's in one place and his hand somewhere else, he can move both. That's all I've given him. I started, and I was kind of giving it as he went, adding, and one of the readers said, yeah, I really like this one. Of course, each time Sid's going to develop a new power, and it's like, rats, he caught me. So at that time, Sid has developed no new powers, and he will not get any more. So it's very much deciding. There's a scene in Roger Rabbit where Roger has been handcuffed to Eddie Valiant, and he's been trying to get it, find a key. He's been trying to use a saw to break it, and Roger, to help him, slips his hand out and starts holding the saw for him. He's like, "You could have done that any time." He said, "No, only when it's funny." So that's pretty much how I give Sid powers. I give him that work for the plot or that are funny, because I am not above a cheap joke.
Yeah, somehow I had that feeling, and there might be cheap jokes, but there are no such thing as cheap laughs.
I like that.
It works only if you don't think about it too hard. That sentence. Charlaine, I wanted to take it to you and also introduce the idea of, a lot of your, one thing I noticed in particular is that your vampires coming out of the coffin and the way that you use your vampires, it seems to bring the idea of social issues that are sort of real world a little more closely to mind in terms of, making analogies. It's a little more easy to make some of these analogies. And so I wanted to talk about, how do you think about social issues or dynamics in your work and echoing them, or do you feel like they just creep in on their own?
It's deliberate.
I'm glad to hear that.
I've had people ask me if I know that there are social issues in the books. I'm going, yeah, I'm aware of that. No, it's by total accident.
I don't know how that got in there.
I want to get my 2 cents in. I want to get my feelings in about how things are going and a better way to be than some other ways. But I don't think you ever win anybody over by shaking your finger at them or preaching to them. I think you have to just say, isn't this nice? Or isn't this a good point of view that they're trying to be taken seriously as citizens? Isn't this good that people are treating them with tolerance and respect? Of course, there's always the less fun side of any issue, but I'm trying to say the world would be better if we all did this a little bit instead of being so judgy.
Is this part of where your ideas come from? Like, do you take inspiration from social dynamics and then, think about how would you replicate them using these more fantastical devices?
It's more like I have a chance to do something. I'm an entertainer. I'm not a world-changing person, but I like to have a chance to say, I think there is a way for us to be better. I think there's a way for people to live together better.
I agree.
And that this is the vehicle I choose to express that.
Yeah. All right. And I'm gonna turn it over to Patty now, who I think one thing that I love about your world is I feel like it captures a lot of interpersonal personal dynamics really well. Like you heard me tell a tech bro who I should really have kept a professional relationship with, that he needed to go read about coyote shapeshifters to understand what was going on in business meetings. So I think how do you think about pulling dynamics you see in the world kind of into reality with by making them magical almost?
I've always been fascinated about why people do things. And I think that maybe my association with horses has let me see that a lot of human interaction is herd-based. We establish who's in charge. We establish who needs to be listened to more, who needs more support. And we do all that with nonverbal cues. And I tell people always, and my in-laws laugh, that my werewolves are based on my in-laws. I grew up in a family of intellectuals who are very mild-mannered. Okay, my mother had an Irish temper, I will admit, but it was never directed, and it was never a power play. It was just frustration letting itself out. My husband's family are all super dominant type A people that are wound up really, really tight, and they will all agree with me. And so going to one of their, and he was the oldest of 7 kids. So going to their parties or going to the holidays were very interesting, in the best Chinese sense of the word. You just waited for what was going to happen, and they all coped because they loved each other very, very much, and because there was an established hierarchy with Mike's dad at the top. And his mom sharing that, and sometimes subtly being the one at the top, sometimes not so subtly being the one at the top too. And by being super polite, they had very good manners. So when my sister-in-law was reading my book, she called me up. She goes, "Patty, I think I was at that dinner." But people fascinate me, and the way in which some people can say things and it's totally offensive, and another person can say exactly the same thing and have it not be offensive at all. I had a boss once who used to make fun of you when you made a mistake, and he did it in such a way that it wasn't hurtful. It didn't make you put up your defenses. When usually in a job and your boss comes down and says, "You did this wrong," your defenses come up and you immediately try to defend yourself. And the way he did it with humor took away all of that. And by golly, you never made that mistake again. It was really, really well done. He was a really good leader. And so I pay attention to those kinds of things. And then I bring it out and bring it back into the book. Because I think one of the things about having dangerous animals, which werewolves are, who live together in a pack, is there's some reason, there has to be something that keeps them from killing each other. And so I worked with that. And I remember I'm trying to remember who it was that said it the first time. I've heard it over and over again. All stories are about people. It doesn't matter if you tell science fiction or cozy mysteries or horror, it's always about people. And that's where the focus of your story should be. And as long as you can keep that going, it doesn't matter if your people are vampires or werewolves or elves or cats or, rabbits, as in Watership Down, it's ultimately about people.
Absolutely. All right, we've got time for just one or two more. And so I want to make it a little bit of a twofer, just because I have 2 things I want to talk about. So I'm going to go to you first, Dana. I know, I'm just cheating. Production tells me 1 and I'm like 1.5. So Dana, the 2 are, what is the hardest thing that you find about world building? And what are you excited to tackle next?
The hardest thing, I think, has to be with finding the right things to limit my characters, because I'm so excited about going around with someone who has superpowers or is smart or can teleport. I think one of the things I should have done with the Fangborn books was have something that everyone knows from traditional vampire stories be fatal to them. I was trying to go too far away from that. If I had one thing that was quite obvious, I made up things that could kill them. But if it was familiar and recognizable, that would have been better. And I think that, so it's trying to find the way to limit things in an interesting way, but I can still have fun. And the thing I'm excited about working on, I am working on a book with demons set in the 1920s. Flappers and demons. And it's given me a lot of really cool things to explore about our present time. But as we've been talking about world building, you can talk about social issues that are important to you, but aren't whacking someone over the head, as Charlaine was mentioning. You can build up sympathy for the characters and then say, oh, we pull back and say, oh, wow, this situation looks kind of familiar. Maybe there are a couple ways for me to think about this. And it's been hard, but it's been fun. And if I can find, there's one or two things I need to figure out before it's finally done, but I'm having a blast with it. The idea of a car chase where they're going upwards of 25 miles an hour is
I will read the heck out of that. All right, Charlaine, I'm just going in reverse order of the readings. What is the hardest part of world building for you, and what you're excited to tackle next?
The hardest part is figuring out all the consequences of a power or limitation that you give your supernatural creatures, because at some point down the line, you're going to want them to do something completely different, and you're going to say, they can't, because, I had one vampire hide a body in an apartment when he had never been invited in.
Oh.
And I thought, and that made it into the book. So I sat there and I thought, oh, blank. And I had to work out this whole bogus story of how he could actually do it in case anybody called me on it. So I did, but luckily, people will catch the strangest things.
Right, defensively.
And it will hound you the rest of your life. Like changing one character, I did this from a werfox into a were-rabbit or something. And I never heard the end of it. But this huge error, no one caught. And I'm going, I got to pass on that one. And the thing the second part was what I'm looking forward to most.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Finding out whether or not my editor accepts the 2 proposals I just sent in. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Can you tell us anything about them? You don't have to, but if you can.
Well, it's a continuation of the Lisbeth Rose series. I would really like to write more books. One of them features Lisbeth, and one of them possibly her little sister Felicia. So I'm waiting to hear on that.
You just turned in the 3rd Gadi Rose novel for publication?
I have turned it in, and it will be out February 23rd, 2021.
Yay!
Awesome. Toni, what is the hardest part of world building for you, and what are you excited to tackle next?
So far, always consistency. Is if I said it once, I've got to stick with it. The person going in the door, those things will trip you up every time because you want to make the story work, and sometimes the rules you set don't apply. Mm-hmm. What I'm working on next is something totally different. I'm a big fan of capers, like the show Leverage and The Sting. And so I'm trying to do kind of a cozy caper. It won't be paranormal at all. If I finish it and it sells, that is. Otherwise, it won't be anything. But the idea of a woman who's kind of a retired con artist, and she's kind of a moral con artist. She still uses her powers a little bit, as it were, but only for good. And it's kind of growing into a family, because I thought, well, why would this young woman be a retired cozy? So I gave her sisters. So her mother kind of this godmother of cozy, of capers, and her sisters are Faith, Hope, and of course her name is Patience, because there is security in this family.
Oh.
So that's what I'm working on now. I've been researching cons and con artists, and I've done a couple of chapters for my agent, who's had to go through it several times before we got to what he thought would be a good good place to move on from. So that's what I'm working on now.
Well, if we get any unusual emails to the mailing list, we'll know who it's from. And last but not least, Patty, world building. What is hardest, and what are you excited to tackle?
So right now I'm writing the 19th book in this shared world, and it's really hard to keep track of everything I've ever said in 19 books or 18 books before it, and all the short stories, and making sure all of the characters are the same, and the you know, the powers everybody has are the same, and that I haven't forgotten something. Somebody's been able to do something, you know, 12 books back, they could do this, and it would make this big trouble that they're having go so much easier, all of those things. And I do have people who read and go through and help me with keeping everything in line, but I have to write the story first, and I have to remember those things first. And what I'm looking forward to tackling next is my next thing that I'm really excited about is make people like Leah without changing her character.
Never.
She's still the same person, but that people will like her without despising Bran. So that's a fine line to talk, and I'm really excited about trying it. We'll see.
We know you can do it. We know you can do it.
You can make anybody unlikable.
Right? Unlikable is easy. Likable is harder. So we'll see.
Oh my gosh, I'm so there for that. I think there's so much value in the redemption arc, because it's this forced moment of empathy where you've taken someone you've really loved hating, and now you have to see that like they're a person too, and they probably don't wake up in the morning thinking I'm the bad guy. Not that many people do. Oh, I can't wait.
I do.
Who does?
Dana does. Yes. I believe that about Dana.
I know her well.
But she'll do it in chipmunk voice.
Dana, I can tell my boyfriend is dialed into the call because I just heard a laugh from the other room. Well, all right.
But mine is an evil chipmunk voice.
I would also read about an evil chipmunk if any of you all have a Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I mean, we're all fans here. I can just say personally, like I really take refuge in a lot of your worlds, as bloody and fantastical as they may be. I just think what you guys do and is really beautiful, and it's fun, and it really does teach people a lot of really interesting lessons about empathy and how our society works. It's my favorite intersection of all of these genres. And from today, I think one of the coolest things to see was how supportive you are of each other's work and of other folks in the genre. It just really has been special. It's been interesting hearing how many answers actually brought up the realities of the publishing world as something that none of us see, though we're, readers are the other side of it, but we don't always see those forces and how they help shape the work that we actually see or not. It sounds crazy to hear that, if we're all on this call and we all want to buy or download it, that there's still another process happening. There's a whole other entity. So thank you guys so much for coming. I would do this anytime. It sounds like we've seen volunteer readers in the chat. But thank you guys so much. This has been Essence of Wonder with Gadi Evron. Gadi is around somewhere. He may or may not come back on, but we do this every week. We will be back next Saturday, and our show it's not urban fantasy every week, but it is always something interesting with a bunch of great friends to discuss a cool topic with us.
Thank you
so much. It's been so much fun.
It has been.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great way to spend the afternoon.
It really has. And thank you to the alpacas for joining us. Everybody.
Yay.
I love the alpacas. Yay!
Yay, alpacas.